Greetings, students. This week we're going to be talking about political systems and economies, politics and money. And this is something that is going to be a significant theme throughout this course. We're going to be looking at how different governments work across the world, and we're going to look at how their economies work and how their economies kind of tie together. So this lecture is going to focus primarily on the different models of government that are used across the world. So when we talk about an absolute monarchy, or if we talk about a parliament or a presidential system, you'll understand the basics of what all these terms mean. But before we get into the systems themselves, we do need to just have a quick word on this idea of a political spectrum. Now, anybody that is really familiar with the concept of a political spectrum knows that this singular line of left and right is overly simplistic. Of course, there are many more dimensions to it, but we are going to hear these terms again and again in this class: left, right, liberal, conservative, and they're going to mean slightly different things around the world, but there are some unifying worldviews that fit somewhat on one side or the other. But I do want to emphasize what we're about to go over is an oversimplification of different political viewpoints. So don't take this as hard and fast, but take this as a starting point of understanding different ways of seeing politics and different political views of the world. Now, going back a little over 200 years, political viewpoints have been often categorized into left-wing or right-wing. And on the left, we have ideologies that are sometimes called liberal, progressive, socialist, or if you go really extreme to the left, communistic. And on the right, we have political ideologies that are sometimes called conservative, or libertarian, or nationalistic. And if you go really far to the right, you end up in an area that's called fascism. Probably at the most fundamental level, left-wing views have a tendency to try to imagine a better future, that there is a belief that humanity is moving towards a more just and equitable society, and so it has to go through difficult changes in order to realize that goal of equality for everybody. On the right, there is a tendency to look towards the past, to look to things that have already worked, to conserve the things in society that don't need to be changed, or at least are perceived not to need to be changed. And so on the left, you have this idea of progress and movement, and on the right, you have this idea of conserving the things that are already there. And this really ends up expressing itself in a few other different ways, where people on the left have a tendency to celebrate new differences that arise in society, or I should really say new differences that are acknowledged in society. So the gay rights movement, and acknowledging that gay people have the same rights as straight people. And so the left is okay with a little bit, I don't want to say chaos, but a little bit more flux in society. On the right, there is a really strong emphasis on stability and security, that you can't have a free society if everything's always going crazy. So given the choice between expanding rights but causing social disruption, or maintaining security by not changing things so everything feels nice and stable, the folks on the left would say, go ahead and shake things up. The folks on the right would say, no, we need to hold on to the things that make our society work. We need to maintain stability. And I want to emphasize again, this is an overly simplistic bit. Of course there's people on the left that have things they don't want to change in society. And of course there are people on the right who have views that have evolved over time and are okay with society evolving over time. These are just really basic distinctions of the movements as a whole. The diagram up here explains it as social change on the left and the maintenance of status quo on the right. There is also some differences between the two in how they think economic systems should work. On the left, there is a focus on the collective good. The idea that the government should be involved in making sure that everybody has some basic needs filled, that everybody has access to education, a popular thing is everybody has access to health care, and they want the government to be involved in regulating things. If you go back like 130 years, a lot of milk producers quite often would just send out things like water with some chalk mixed into it. And leftists said, I want the government to come in and inspect that to make sure the things the society is buying are what they say they are. On the right, there's usually more emphasis on individual economic rights. The idea that individuals should be given the freedom to be entrepreneurs, to come up with new ideas, and that can be a little bit messy. That does mean that some people might get left behind, and it does mean that there are going to be some charlatans that are able to pull a fast one on the public. But on the right side, on the more conservative side of the economic spectrum, the belief is that ultimately those people will lose out. If you make a bad product, people will stop buying your product. And so on the left, we quite often hear about things like socialism. And if you go really far to the left, communism. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but the idea behind socialism is that the economy should be constructed for the good of the society, not for the individuals that are managing the economy. Communism really is the belief that the government should own everything. On the right, there is this idea of individual liberty to do what you want economically, and this position is called libertarianism. If you go really far to the right with libertarianism, you really enter into what we would call a totally capitalistic society, or one where people are able to accrue as much wealth as they want without really having any checks on their power. Also on the right, there's a little bit more of a tendency to focus on things like faith, trying to maintain religion in society, and that, here in the United States, usually that means focusing on trying to maintain Christianity within society and even within the government. In the Middle East, that means maintaining Islam in society. In India, that means maintaining Hinduism in society. And throughout the government, that is what we would call a conservative point of view, or a societally conservative point of view. But if you go really far to the right, what you end up with is something called fascism. And fascism really is the belief that the government should be in total control or have the total power to enforce appropriate morality, or what the people in charge believe to be appropriate morality. So religion is quite often involved in that. Nationalism really is the main focus of fascism. The nation is considered to be almost on par with the religion of that nation. That almost all things are correct if they are in service to making the nation a greater, more powerful nation. And so another way of thinking of going to these extremes, if you go really extreme to the left, the term that we use is radical. And radical simply means wanting to significantly change society, not be held back by any type of conservatism, go full force and try to give as many rights to as many people as possible, and that includes economic rights, redistribute income across everybody as equally as possible, and not really take time for society to catch up. On the right, going really far to the right, the term that is usually used is reactionary. Reactionary really is the idea of not just wanting to maintain what one has, but saying that things have changed so much, we need to go backwards. We need to go back to the time when the country was great. In the United States, on the right wing, the tendency is to look to things like the 1950s and the social structure of the 1950s, the family structure of the 1950s. Two other words that you need to be familiar with. So again, conservatism is the idea of maintaining what's already there, and it usually focuses on things like religion and family structure. Libertarianism is the idea that individuals should not be constrained by the government, at least when it comes to economic matters, but even in what they do with their everyday lives. So a lot of libertarians would say we shouldn't outlaw drugs. If somebody wants to do drugs, that's their business. What's interesting about this and why this does get kind of messy is because on the left there's often a belief of we should not outlaw drugs. Not necessarily because it should be okay for individuals to do it, but because people shouldn't be punished for having an affliction like alcoholism or drug addiction. Two terms that you'll often hear on the left is liberal and progressive. These mean pretty similar things. Liberals are just folks that want to create more liberty for as many people as possible. And that may even say if it means taking away privileges from some parts of society that have had more liberty than others to distribute it then that still on the left would be a more liberal position. Progressives have a tendency to see themselves as being a little bit farther to the left of liberals. They want to see society progress. Progressives want to make sure that wealth doesn't accumulate in one small social class. You might have heard that term, the 1%, the super wealthiest society. They want to make sure that that is being taxed at a high enough rate that things like medical care for all are available, that affordable college or free college is available, just like the K through 12 system. And it was progressives who primarily pushed for things like free parks, free libraries, and free public education for all. All right, again, this is really basic. It's much more complex than that. There is nobody or just about nobody that is just on the left or just on the right. Most of us have leftist and rightist views of many different policies. We're not going to deal with that a whole lot. I just want to make sure that you understand those terms left, right, liberal, conservative, radical, reactionary, because you are going to come across them as we do research in this class and in some of our lectures as well. All right, government systems. Now, all governments have what we call a head of state and a head of government. A head of state would be somebody like the Queen of Britain. The head of state represents that country as a whole, represents the people as a whole. And a head of state usually doesn't really have a whole lot of legal powers. They're the ones that go to the ceremonies, they're the ones that give speeches, but they are not the ones that are making laws or enforcing laws. That is the job of the head of government. So again, kind of sticking to this example where the Queen of Britain is the head of state, the head of government of Britain is the Prime Minister of Britain. That's, kind of like our president, the person that is what we often call the chief executive or the chief executive officer of that country, the person who executes the laws. Now, some countries combine the two roles. As you can see on this map, most of the countries in the Americas, the person that's head of state and the person that's head of government is the same person, like here in the United States. In the United States, the president speaks for the country. The president is the one that runs most of the major ceremonies or is the focus of most of the major ceremonies, but the president is also the chief executive officer. They're the ones that are running the government. Though you can also see that the majority of the world does not follow that model. They have separated the two, head of state and head of government. And I'm just going to go ahead and put in my little aside here. There is something that is quite helpful in that, because the head of government is a political role, right? Whoever's in charge of the government comes from a specific party and has a specific point of view that doesn't necessarily represent all the people of the country. The head of state in these countries where it is separated, the head of state does not have a political role. The head of state, their job is simply to try to unify the country, to find all the things that people have in common and represent those things that people have in common. This also means that the head of government doesn't get to go to all the cool ceremonies, which really makes it possible for an incumbent, whoever's already in office, to stay in office, because they always get what we often call the bully pulpit. They get to be out there representing the country in addition to leading the country. So there's a decent reason for separating them. But having them be in the same place doesn't mean the system can't work. The United States has done pretty darn well over the last couple hundred years. You also need to be familiar with the difference between presidential and parliamentary governments. In a presidential government, the chief executive, or the person that runs the head of government, the one that runs the country, is voted on directly by the people, separately from them voting on their legislature. And so this is the system we have here in the United States. We vote on the president, and then we vote on our individual representatives. A parliamentary system is one where you just vote on your representative. And so once you vote those folks in, whichever party has the most people in it, whichever party has the most power, then is able to elect their leader as the chief executive. Now, I do want to bring up here in parliamentary systems, because people don't have to worry about forming a coalition, don't have to worry about forming a party that can take on the whole national vote like they do in presidential systems, because we as a nation vote on our president, because people are only voting in their own areas, in their own legislative districts. Because of that, it's actually possible to build a local party and to get somebody elected to the legislature that does not actually have connections with other politicians outside of there. And so what that means is in parliamentary systems, you quite often have more than two parties. You actually have multiple parties, but somebody still has to win the majority. And so if you have, instead of just two parties, if you have multiple parties, those multiple parties are going to divvy up the legislature in a way that nobody can win the majority, or quite often can't win the majority, in which case what ends up happening is that the most powerful parties, the biggest ones, have to form what we call coalitions. And so you might have a party that is center-left, that it's pretty moderate. It doesn't go really far to the left. It's just a bit to the left. But it doesn't win the majority. Now, it can choose to either join up with other moderate groups, maybe even some center-right groups, or it could choose to team up with people further to the left so that all the people on the left, or all the parties on the left, can combine their numbers and become the majority, and of course then elect their leader as prime minister. Or another major party that's able to get more people on board might be able to actually run the country for a while. So you can see how parliamentary systems at the very least make more room for more than two parties. But because presidential systems have these national elections that you have to win the majority in, people have to form those coalitions before voting even takes place. They have to build a national coalition before all the other legislators get voted in, which means that the parties essentially whittle themselves down to just usually two options in presidential systems. Now, there are different terms that are used for the legislature. Here we have the legislative branch, which includes the House and the Senate. We also call it Congress. Some countries will call it something like the Assembly. And even in some of these presidential countries, you still have what is called a parliament. And over in the parliamentary system, of course, most of these are called parliaments, but that's not true of all of them. Israel has a parliamentary system, and they call their legislature the Knesset. And in some cases, there is a third system, a mixed system. And in that mixed system, the people still elect in the president. The president usually acts as the head of state. Then they vote in their parliament, their legislature, and that legislature picks a prime minister. And then they still vote in their legislature, and usually what the president will do is pick the person from that legislature that seems to have the most support and give them a chance to form a coalition so that they can put together a working government. And so you have a president that quite often will have some power. They do get to choose who the prime minister should be. But even in those cases, almost all the time, the legislature still has to approve of the president's choice. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds of this. So just to make sure that we understand the basics, presidential system, people elect in their chief executive, their head of government, and then they elect in their legislature separately. In a parliamentary system, the people elect in their Congress or their parliament, and then that parliament elects in a prime minister, another type of chief executive. And in the mixed system, people will vote in a president and a parliament. The president will pick who they want to be prime minister, and the parliament will agree on that or not agree on that. Absolute monarchies. Now, if you've ever thought about like kings from the medieval period of Europe, you probably envisioned them as absolute monarchs. An absolute monarch is just somebody who is head of state and head of government. They get to say whatever they want. There is no check on their power. And the way that you really should be thinking about this is an absolute monarch is above the law. In an absolute monarchy, the law literally comes from the monarch. And the monarch can be a king, a queen, an emperor, in some cases even like a duke or an emir. And absolute monarchies used to be the standard. This is how many countries have functioned throughout history. In the modern day, there's not very many of them left. As we're going to see, there are some in the Middle East, but certainly not all Middle Eastern countries. Morocco, Bhutan, and Brunei are also absolute monarchies. You need to be familiar with this. We'll be covering them as we go through these countries again. But the law comes from the ruler, comes from the monarch. The monarch is above the law, and nobody has any type of check on the ruler's power. Constitutional monarchies are systems that still have some type of a monarch, still some type of a king or queen or emperor or emir. But that monarch is underneath the law. That monarch is constrained by the law. They don't get to just make whatever laws they want, and they themselves have to obey the law. Now, in some cases, those monarchs still have a little bit of power, still have a little bit of say in their country, but more and more commonly, those monarchs have no say in their country. So the Queen of Britain does not have any real powers. Technically, she does still have some constitutional powers, but certainly if she ever used them, Parliament would probably take them away from her. The same thing is true in Japan. The Emperor of Japan has no legal powers whatsoever. And in all these cases, constitutional monarchs almost always function as the head of state, but they are not the head of government. That is generally held by a prime minister. So when you think constitutional monarchy, you should be thinking a monarch that's under the law, that is the head of state, but does not have much or any legal power. And just real quick, I want to draw your attention here. Most of the constitutional monarchies on here are in dark green, but there are countries that still use the Queen of Britain as their head of state. So the Queen of Britain is also the Queen of Canada, and the Queen of Australia, and the Queen of New Zealand. All these light green countries are part of what we call the Commonwealth. This is just old British colonies that even once they got their independence, they maintained some connections to Britain. And the Commonwealth countries actually do. They have their own games they play with each other. They have some citizen rights where it's kind of easy to move from one country to another within the Commonwealth, especially from the Commonwealth to Britain. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the Commonwealth this semester, but I want you to be aware that it exists. The next up is what we call a democratic republic. Now, I do want to be clear here. This is a map of all the democracies on the planet. As you can see, there's still not that many, or at least not that many functioning ones. But that means it also includes the constitutional monarchies. So obviously, Britain is not a democratic republic. Canada is not a democratic republic. They're both constitutional monarchies, but most of Europe are democratic republics. Most of the Americas are the same. And I want to break down these two terms very quickly. A republic really just means that the government belongs to the public. There's no single individual that is considered to be the sovereign or the top of the country. It comes from an old Latin term, res publica, just means public stuff. And so in a republic, there is no king, queen, there is no monarch. That is the main distinction. When you hear republic, that just means there's no queen, there's no king, there's no emperor, there's no monarch. The other half of this word, democratic, needs to be talked about just a little bit here. Democratic just means the rule of the people. And in most democratic republics, really in all modern democratic republics, what that means is the people have voted in representatives to run their country. That's what a legislature is. That's what a parliament is. That's what a head of government is. They're just representatives of the people, at least in democratic republics. They are representatives of the people. You might have heard this argument before that we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic. And the truth is, we live in a democratic republic. There are different types of republics, and there are different types of democracies. We are a combination of the two. Though there are such things as what we call direct democracy. When people are talking about living in a democracy where people vote on everything, that's what we would call a direct democracy. You know, I don't want to get too deep into the history of it, but if you go back to the original democracies of Greece, it was really democratic. They elected in the generals of their armies. They would essentially have a few hundred people, maybe over 1,000 people, sit on juries to vote on the fate of all the citizens that were brought before the courts. But even in the modern day, many of us still partake in what we call direct democracy. If you have ever voted on a measure in your state, if there was ever, or a proposition, if there was ever something on the ballot where you actually got to vote directly on a law, we call that a plebiscite. A plebiscite is a law that's voted on directly by the people. And so we have some direct democracy, at least in many of our states here in the United States. But we live in a democratic republic. We live in a democracy. We live in a republic. We have fused the two together like many other countries have. There are, though, what we call single-party republics. And these are republics that, again, they don't have a king, they don't have a queen. They are, the government is supposed to be representing the people. But in these cases, there is only one party that is allowed. The clearest example of this is probably modern-day China. The Communist Party of China is in charge of China. No other parties are allowed to exist. Now, to some extent, there's still some democracy inside of the party. If you join the party, in some cases, you still get a vote on who's going to be the mayor of a city or who's going to be on a council. But that would still be a democracy that is just limited to members of the party. And so single-party republics do have a tendency to be pretty oppressive. They don't make room for other points of view, as opposed to democratic republics, which usually have multiple parties and multiple individuals with multiple points of view that are always duking it out in debates and in elections. That doesn't happen in single-party republics. And beyond formal single-party republics where the party is like the Communist Party of China, there are many single-party republics that essentially the party in control is the military. Sometimes you'll hear these referred to as military juntas. A junta is essentially a council of generals. And so places like Egypt are ruled by a single party. There are multiple parties in Egypt, but the military really runs the entire show. That single party is in charge. And finally, there are some countries that we would call theocracies. Theocracy just means rule of religion. And there's two major ones that I want to bring to your attention. One of these theocracies is what we would call probably a constitutional monarchy. The Vatican. This is, of course, where the Pope lives. It's in Rome, but the Vatican is actually its own country. It's this little chunk of Rome that is an independent country for the Catholic Church. That is a theocracy. It is ruled by a priest, the Pope. And that is a monarchy. The Pope is the prince of the church. And the other one I want to bring your attention to is Iran. Iran, it calls itself an Islamic republic. So Iran actually does have a parliament and does have a president, and people do vote in elections in Iran. But those elections are really controlled by the elite Islamic clergy of Iran. The supreme leader of Iran is a Islamic clergyman. He's called the Grand Ayatollah. And so there is this representative part to it, and it is a semi-democratic republic, democratic republic light, but it's also a theocracy. Need to be familiar with all these different types of governance. And finally, I do want to talk just a little bit about the difference between capitalism and communism. In capitalism, individuals are allowed to and encouraged to own what we call the means of production. They're encouraged to own the factories. They're encouraged to own all of the different expensive tractors that are used for plowing the fields, the machinery that makes society work. And so in a capitalist society, you have what we call a capitalist class or an investor class. These are the people that invest in businesses, invest in machinery in order to get things built and created. And they take risks with their own money, which means that they have a motive to make good decisions. As a matter of fact, we call this the profit motive, the idea of using your money in a way that will make more money. That's capitalism in a nutshell. Of course, there's still people that have to make the things that are going to make the money for the rich people. But the belief in capitalism is that a rising tide lifts all boats. Yes, there's this super rich class that owns most of things, but as they get richer, we get new inventions like cell phones and air conditioning and dishwashers. And so all of our lives get better as these capitalists come up with new ideas and invest smartly in new ideas. This, of course, is a right-leaning position. This is a more conservative position. Communism, however, is the belief that the economy should be ran by the state. It really, what communists would say is that the people, all of the people, should own the means of production together. Of course, somebody still has to coordinate it, and that ends up being the central government. So in communist countries, we have what are called planned economies. A planned economy is when a government figures out or thinks they figure out, okay, we're going to need to have 10,000 pounds of pork, we're going to need to have 800 cords of wood, we're going to need to have 20,000 pounds of coal for this province or this city or this country to function for the next year. So they send out government agents to run companies that will fulfill those quotas, that will make enough so that everybody is going to be provided for. Of course, this hits a lot of snags, because if you plan on growing a certain amount of wheat that year and there's a drought, all of a sudden you fall short. Not to mention the people that are just filling quotas, they don't really have a motive to, A, get the quotas right. They could always falsify paperwork, and B, create a good enough product that it's going to serve other people, because people have to take it whether or not it's any good, because that's all there is. And C, they don't have to treat their workers well at all, because those workers still have to get the job done by law. And so communist countries certainly have had their fair share of shortcomings. And communist countries also have a tendency to be authoritarian. There are some significant caveats to this. All communist countries were usually authoritarian before they turned communist. And so there are issues with saying that communism caused that authoritarianism, but we're not going to get super deep into that history. That's for a modern world history class. But of course, like anything else, there is this middle ground between the two, and that middle ground is quite often either called democratic socialism or social democracy. These terms have been thrown around so much that they don't necessarily have their original meanings. But communism is officially a form of socialism. Socialism is the idea that the means of production should be used to benefit everybody in society, though it can be accomplished a whole lot of different ways. Workers can own their own factories as a collective. Ma and pa shops can still exist in a lot of socialist ideas, especially in democratic socialist or social democracy ideas. And in these two terms I'm using, social democracy and democratic socialism, plenty of people would debate that they mean two different things, and then they would have different definitions of what those two different things are. And so we're just going to go ahead and talk about them as the same thing, because they essentially are. Democratic socialism essentially just says that there is a floor that everybody has to be provided with. And in some forms of it would even say there's a ceiling that at some point you can't get more wealth than that, because, if you end up owning a third of the economy, you kind of own that country. You own the government of that country. And so democratic socialists would say, we need to make sure that doesn't happen. And so what they usually advocate for is what we call a progressive tax, where the more money you make, the higher percentage gets taken away. So, just to give you a basic idea of a progressive tax, $50,000 a year. You're making $50,000 a year, and it's decided that anything up to $50,000 a year, no tax. But the next $50,000 you make might have a 20% tax on it. So you get your first $50,000, and then in the second $50,000, you're going to get $10,000 of that taxed away. But then maybe in the next $100,000 that you make, there's going to be a 40% tax. And so you still keep that original chunk, but each level of money that you make that gets more and higher up, you're going to pay a higher percentage on it. So it's harder to get richer and richer and richer. And then that money is used to make sure that everybody has housing, everybody has food, everybody has an education, everybody has medical care, regardless of what they're doing for work. And so the idea in democratic socialism or social democracy is that the rich shouldn't be allowed to just get as much money as they can possibly make. It should get harder to make money as you get richer. And that the poor, no matter how poor they are, should all be given a basic standard of living. It's almost like a compression of capitalism, but it is not an iron fist of communism. And even between that, capitalism, democratic socialism / social democracy, and communism, there's still plenty other shades of gray. But I just want you again to be familiar with these terms as we move forward.